All right, let's talk about Winding Rivulet a little bit. So I'm not an expert on this map, as you'll soon see. I mean, you could argue I'm not an expert on any map at this point, as I'm still fairly new to this game, especially compared to some of the folks around. But I'll show you a few spots. What's up, Uther? I'll show you a few spots that when I was here that I really enjoyed. And maybe that'll at least be enough to get you started. I think we'll go to the pond first. So the pond is over here. It's probably the safest place that you can fish at. And then I'll show you this spot here, this beach here. And then we'll talk, we may not go to all the spots, but we'll talk about the spinning spots that are further along the map. And those are kind of the three things that we're going to talk about briefly here. Yeah, and that's the thing, Armstrong. I think your experience spinning is going to, at least my experience was that when I started at Curie, that's where I got all of my experience spinning. I really hadn't done much spinning until then, for whatever reason. All right, so we're coming up on the pond here. And there's actually a nice spot where you can kind of do a variety of stuff. Of course, some of this depends on what your gear looks like. But this hill here is sort of an interesting place. And I'll kind of show you what I'm talking about. We'll get out our feeder line so I can show you. You don't, not that you necessarily want to have catfish on there. I mean, catfish. Not that you want to have fish pieces, because you will catch the catfish potentially. But so from this hill, you have access to really the entire pond, as well as you can still throw for the river. So it's kind of a fun place to get a little bit of variety. If you want to throw one of your feeder lines down into the river there, you can do that and actually catch the fish from all the way down here. You can also get out your other feeder, which in this case doesn't have a reel on it. So let's fix that real quick. So you can get out your other feeder, which of course these feeders that I've got are a little overpowered for this at this point. But I really recommend throwing for the lily pads with your feeder line. And we overshot it there, but that's fine. That's a really good spot, over where you see those lily pads down there. Let's tighten these feeders up. Of course, the pond is a lot more shallow, so you don't have to wait as long for it to hit the bottom over here. And so, if you have a third feeder line, you can put that in the pond as well. Another spot to put your feeders would just be over on the opposite shore, kind of right before you hit the bank. And then for your third rod, for newer players, if you haven't gotten into spinning yet, you may be doing floating. And let's go ahead and just point out one thing with float fishing here. Especially at night when you're here, if you want to go for the rough, which, let's look at that real quick. There are regular rough here, which you will see orders for them in the cafe like there are right now. And you basically want to use either worms, night crawlers, red worms, even maggots. There's also a new breed called the Donuts Rough. Most of them I've seen have been caught on worms, but you're starting to see maggots and night crawlers show up on this list as well. And I think you want to have it around depth of 50 centimeters. People that have got more experience going after these might have a different opinion there, but this is basically the spot you want to be at here in the pond. Now it's got to be at nighttime, which we're getting close to nighttime. But you basically just put it right there, or even not even that far, quite honestly. Like, still keep it pretty close to the bank. But you'll see a lot of rough being caught right here. And then if you get lucky, you'll catch the more rare version of the rough, and you'll get a lot of money for that. So for new players that come to Winding Rivulet for the first time, I think that the pond is a safer place to fish initially, while you're still building up your starter gear and kind of trying to get some upgrades. it's a pretty good idea. It's actually, it's probably pretty similar. That's a decent size. It's a decent sized crucian there. It's pretty similar to fishing at some of the spots you were probably used to fishing at Mosquito Lake. You're going to get just a lot of crucians and roaches, gibbles, and that kind of stuff. If you do spin, though, you can even spin in the pond. You can catch pike and other smaller predator fish. So that's to me, the pond is a place that, especially if you find the river itself with the current. If you're wanting to do float fishing is much more difficult with the strong current of the river. And honestly, you can catch a lot of fish, a high quantity of fish out of the pond. So it's a pretty good place early on here at Winding Rivulet to fish. And so let's go ahead and get our fishing poles out of the water so we can go look at a couple other places before it gets dark. You have to go back to the bridge to go around to where I want to show you next, but if you come to the sort of end, there's a beach down here. You can see it right there in the distance. You can, if you want to do feeder lines into the river or sort of back into the pond area, that's not a bad spot either. I've always kind of preferred this hill because you can be close to the pond and really do most of your fishing in the pond while still having a line in to the river if you'd like. So let's talk about the river a little bit more, and this will take a minute to get there. As with all locations, you know, a lot of questions come up with what bait to use and what types of equipment gear to use. And if you're first starting out, you're going to be limited by what you've had the silver to purchase things with, you know, and so you may just be in your, maybe you've made one upgrade by the time you get to Winding Rivulet, so you do want to be mindful. And the best thing to do when you get to a new place is just look and see what's catching stuff. So, you know, I think if you're using, you know, regular worms, even bread, maggots, pearl barley, you know, those are some of my recommendations on what to use when you first get here. You want to be careful with, you know, with some things. If you look at common carp, it's kind of scary to see pearl barley on here. That was just never my experience. I never hooked into any common carp on pearl barley. I used a lot of pearl barley here. So hopefully the spots I show you, that won't happen to you. But you just want to kind of look at the fish you can handle and see what bait will be good for that. And then same if you're spin fishing. You know, let's say you want to go after an asp. You see how sort of the weekly records, at least how big they get, so keep that in mind. But just kind of look and see which, you know, funky minnows. You may not be able to use those yet if you're early level, but there's a handmade spoon and a Slim Shot 15, so that's a spoon that you could very affordably get. So kind of see which lures are working well at that location. It's a good place to start at least, and then you can experiment yourself from there. Most lures will end up working. Some just seem to work better according to how the weather is and then just the different locations, time of day. But the place that I fished the most at when I was here was this beach up here. And I feel like this is a really good place. You've got some spots you can spin from, but I sort of specialize, especially low levels, in feeder fishing or bottom fishing. So what I would do is I would get out my feeder line. A lot of times I'd have pearl barley or, you know, again, earthworms, bread, that kind of stuff. And really I would throw for those branches, the fallen tree or whatever you see coming out of the water. Okay, so kind of on the other side of the bank. Try to get it right around there. Might be about an 80% throw if you don't have many points into the casting distance. And then just set it down over here. It's actually pretty deep in the middle there at least. So this is where we are. There's a hole that's either 3 or 5 meters kind of in this spot. And I guess at night, be a little careful. You know, there are burbot and catfish here. You may not have the... So if you're using night worms or fish pieces, you could certainly get into some fish that you may not want to catch. But again, I just did a lot of fishing from this spot. I kind of leveled through this area, bottom fishing from this spot. And if fish weren't biting, I would move to the pond or move to other places. But I did spend a lot of time here and caught some brim and, you know, a range of other things. But it seemed to be a pretty good spot for me, at least. Now, we won't, it is getting dark soon, but we won't go too much farther. I do just want to mention, if you're into spin fishing, you just want to keep, so we're here, we're kind of getting up here towards this, where camp is. You just, with spin fishing, you know, you might set up maybe you set up a feeder line or two, and then you just give yourself the freedom to kind of explore some. And just look for things like branches in the water, lots of vegetation growing near the banks. And you can definitely find some really good spots, even all the way down. Just follow the river as long as you can on this side. There's just a lot of good spinning spots, and you just basically walk around and try different areas. So if you're into spinning, that's what I would recommend. This river can be really good for spinning. Because of the current, it's a lot harder with float fishing. You know, you'll see if you put a bobber in the water, you'll kind of see that the current's just going to take it downstream. Unless you throw it really shallow. Maybe the current's just moving a little slower right now. I don't know. But typically it'll go at a pretty good pace. There it goes. And you can still catch fish with it. It's just a little more complicated. It's very different than what you're used to. It's where the Balinese or bolo rods come into play if you really want to get into fishing with the current and allowing it to go further downstream, because you actually have instead of the fixed line, the rod and reel. So you can still catch stuff on the float rod, but I found it, if I wanted to float fish, I would go to the pond. And if I want to do feeder line fishing, I would either do the pond or this spot here primarily. Not that it's the only spot here, but it's one that I liked a lot. And then spin fishing, you really can do all over. So there's my little, hopefully that's helpful. I mean, that's just kind of to get you started here, at least what worked for me. But the overall advice I would give you is always just check, see what fish are in the location. And see what's catching those fish. So if you wanted to target asp, let's say, well, this is the sort of the all-time records, right, of winding rivulet, but you go to the weekly and look at asp. Oh, that's the problem with asp, though. You're going to see the Volkov. So I think that's where it gets difficult. I guess you really do have to stay on winding rivulet unless you're looking at a fish that's only found here, which is going to be few and far between. So, but at least it gives you a starting point with what bait to use. And you can kind of look and see what bait not to use as well based on. So if you really want to stay away from 34 kilogram catfish, which I would recommend, even 15 kilogram catfish are going to be terrible for you at this level. If you're new to this area, well, you probably don't want to, go fishing in a real deep hole with night crawlers and pieces of fish, Even though it would be nice to catch burbot, you got to be careful about those catfish for sure. So that's my intro to winding rivulet. I hope it's helpful. Please let me know if you've got questions. I love the storms. And I think we'll go see if we can catch a couple rough before this night's over, and then we're going to move on most likely to Curie Lake. Haven't fished there in a while, so I think we'll do that.